Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today, and thank you for that great introduction, Erin. So let's get started and talk about some gray whales. So gray whales are a baleen whale, and they're named after their beautiful little mottled color that you can see right here. And I'm going to start off by talking about the whole gray whale population that can be found in the northern Pacific Ocean, and then I'm going to kind of zoom in and focus just on the sounders, and then take you through some of the research that I've been doing and some of the data that I've been compiling, and then finally end with some conclusions and recommendations and some key points that I've discovered. So gray whales among whales are kind of unique. They're unique for a few different reasons. Among baleen whales, they're especially unique in that rather than, chasing a bunch of food up to the water column and pinning it at the top and gulp feeding like we associate with humpbacks and blue whales, rather they go down. They're typically benthic feeders, and so they're the vacuum cleaners almost of the ocean floor. They're sucking up sediment and then using that baleen to filter out any invertebrates that are hiding in that ocean sea floor. And so that's one thing that makes them unusual, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. And one of the other things that make them unusual is they have the longest known migration route of any mammal. Of all time. They're the champions of that. They travel anywhere from 10,000 to 12,000 miles a year. And just the context, because that's a huge number, right? That's really hard to wrap your mind around. For context, that would be the equivalent of me swimming from Los Angeles to New York City and back 4 times. That's a huge distance, and they cover that annually. So there's 2 populations of gray whales, and for the purposes of this project, I'm going to be talking about the Eastern Pacific population exclusively. And of that population, a 2016 estimate by NOAA found that there's approximately 27,000 individuals in this population, and gray whales can only be found in the Northern Pacific. There used to be Atlantic gray whales, but due to hunting and whaling practices, they have gone extinct, sadly. But of that 27,000, 13, I'll say that one more time, just 13 individuals come all the way in to Puget Sound every year. And so once I realized this and I learned a little bit more about this, I was like, okay, well, what's bringing them here? What are they finding here? And why have they decided to do a 170-mile detour off the traditional migration route to come into our waters? In order to understand that question, I needed to sort of frame it. I needed to sort of put myself in the research and figure out this story of what could potentially be drawing them here to help better answer the question, where are they, and are they returning to the same areas year after year? And in order to understand gray whales, you need to understand ghost shrimp. And ghost shrimp are their key prey species that they're coming to Puget Sound for. Now, ghost shrimp are a burrowing shrimp, so they like that sediment. Again, this is where those gray whales are feeding. They're tipping their head down and they're sucking up that sediment. So that's where the shrimp can be found. And interestingly, northern Puget Sound has a huge river delta that exits into it. The Snohomish River Delta is the second largest in the state, and it's emptying into Possession Sound. This is an area of water off the coast of Everett. And what this is doing, and the reason the shrimp like this area, is it's providing ideal habitat for them. So it's bringing all of this really yummy detritus from the river, mixing with the channel, and it's providing them a lot of food. And more importantly, it's providing them sediment. So again, this river is carrying tons of sediment every year and emptying out into the channel to form this really large intertidal zone. And the intertidal zone is basically just a fancy word for a mud flat, right? This is where when the tide's all the way out, this is all that exposed muck that you can see. And then when the tide comes in, it can be up to 12 to 15 feet of water it's buried under. And this is where the shrimp live in abundance. One thing that's particularly unique, because again, gray whales are unique among whales, sounders are unique among the gray whales, and the sounders come in and they have learned this high risk, high reward behavior for feeding. So this 30-ton animal is coming into just a few feet of water when the tide is high, and they're again sucking those sediments out of the bottom and feasting on ghost shrimp. And a 2015 study estimated that they were taking about 286 metric tons in just a few months that they're here. And then most interestingly, I found in my research, not all whales do this. So gray whales that are not considered part of the sounders do come into Puget Sound. However, they don't master this feeding strategy and they quickly leave and are not seen again. And so these whales have mastered this and continue to capitalize on it annually in order to feast really on ghost shrimp. And before I go any further, This research would not have been possible without the help of the Cascadia Research Collective team. Huge thank you to John Kalambakidis and Kirsten for all of the work that you guys have done in allowing me to sort of dive really deep into this data set that you've been collecting for the better part of 30 years. So thank you so much. So we have this background. We understand that the gray whales belong to this larger population. We understand that they're coming into Puget Sound. And again, I was looking at, well, where are they going and why? And for those of you who may not be from Washington or may not be familiar, this is sort of a large snapshot of Puget Sound. I'm going to be focusing my research and the study area specifically in this area of Puget Sound. I'm actually coming to you today from Olympia. You can find it at the bottom. Seattle is to the east and the Everett's just a little bit north above Seattle. So one of the first things I did when I got this data set from Cascadia, and I wanted to sort of examine this question of where are the whales, is I took all of these GPS points from all 29 years and I mapped them. I plotted them on a map and I identified individuals based on color. And I did this for a couple reasons. I did this so I could see the spread, the total area that I would be working with, to see if there was any patterns when I initially kind of threw them all up there. The next thing that I did once I had all my points, I needed to divvy it up in a way that I could compare areas to other areas. Now, this was actually surprisingly challenging because unlike land, which has really nice township parcels, county lines that can be easily delineated, water doesn't have that. So I needed to get a little bit creative in how to sort of divvy up these water, because again, this is all connected, it's all Puget Sound, but for the purposes of comparing one area to another, I needed to chop them up. And so we ended up with 7 different areas, and each of these areas was a combination of input from John Kalambakidis from Cascadia, as well as looking at NOAA nautical charts and finding what these water bodies were called. And what I found was pretty interesting. So once I had these two things, I could combine them, right? I had all my points, I had the areas that I'm going to be looking at. So I created something that's called a heat map in GIS. And really what a heat map is it's looking for densities. And so you can see on this figure here, the yellow indicates high density and some of the cooler colors are low density, but there is a presence. And really what you can see is that area of Possession Sound has the most points. There are some, high density areas outside of that, but really it's quite obvious that that is where they were going. So once I knew that, I wanted to know, well, what does that mean? And what does that look like? I have all these little points, but that doesn't really give me a number and it doesn't give me an indication if it's a lot or not a lot. Well, it turns out that 68% of all of the observations were taken in Possession Sound. So an overwhelming majority of all of the observations recorded on the sounders were taken from this area. And so I wanted to zoom in on that a little bit closer to find out who was in this area. And it turns out all 13 of the whales were present at least 1% of the time within Possession Sound, which was really unusual because as you'll see in the next slide, that's not the case for all of the areas. So if we're looking at this, we've got, again, the areas you can see here. I really want to draw your attention to these 2 whales. So we're going to be looking at 21 and 44. And if we look, we can see that they are spending, both of them, the majority of their sightings have been recorded within Possession Sound. That's sort of in line with what we've seen already. But the interesting bits start when you look at the 2nd and 3rd most visited areas, right? So if we look at whale 21, we can see that 46% of the time they can be found in Possession Sound. However, if we look down just one more, we see 29% of the time they're found in Saratoga Passage. This compared to whale 44, again, the vast majority of the time they can be found in Possession Sound, but the 2nd most, they're found in Port Susan. And so that is indicative of not only are these whales coming all of the way off their migration route to come to Puget Sound, but within Puget Sound, they have preferences. And this was, again, in line with some of the researchers that were taking these observations. This is in line with what they're seeing. And the most interesting part I found of all of this is that there are some whales that, they're found in maybe Skagit Bay or Admiralty Inlet, but all of the most highly dense areas or the most observations are all adjacent to Possession Sound. So they're all of these little inlets that I've highlighted. They're actually touching or right next to Possession Sound. And that was really interesting to find. So once I knew where they were hanging out and I knew why, I wanted to see if they're basically hanging out together, right? Are these whales exhibiting social behavior? Are there certain whales that prefer to hang out with another individual versus another? And so I ran a test called a Cooccur test. And this is very preliminary. This is an area where if I had, lots of time. I would love to sort of dive down into this and really figure out some of these relationships. But this preliminary evidence does indicate that they do have individuals that they will sort of be found swimming with. However, it doesn't really tell us the whole picture, which this was the one drawback of this particular test. It doesn't tell me why, if it is significant that they're swimming together, why that might be. We don't know if it's because of social behavior, which the sounders have been exhibited doing. There is a video that one of them was tagged with a little suction cup video, and you can see they're exhibiting social behaviors by rubbing on other individuals. We also don't know if this is a feeding behavior. Again, they're all feeding on ghost shrimp around the same time during that high tide, so it could just be coincidence that maybe they're feeding in the same areas. This is an area for more research. We just don't know. So once I had all of this information and I'm like, okay, they're hanging out in Possession Sound. That's where all the majority of the observations can be found. So now what? How does this fit? Like, why does this research matter? Like, I've been able to answer this question relatively well. And so what am I looking at now? And I really sat back and I thought of ghost shrimp first and foremost, because obviously there's a relationship between the gray whales that are coming into Puget Sound and the ghost shrimp that they're feasting on. And really, I began to question, are we doing enough? Now that we've established that there's this relationship and this is one of the main draws that they're coming into this area, are we doing enough? Are we for this shrimp fishery? Are they abundant enough to continue to sustain this population into the future? Because again, the sounders are coming here specifically for this, and they've learned this feeding strategy to go after this food source. And so how can we protect it to ensure when the sounder population continues to recruit and continues to grow, that this is going to be something that's sustainable? Next, there is an event going on that's kind of an unfortunate one. It's called a UME, or an unusual mortality event. An unusual mortality event is defined as a stranding that involves a significant die-off of a mammal population that demands immediate response. And unfortunately, the gray whales fit that bill. There was a UME that happened in 2016, and there was another one that happened in 2019 and 2020, and could potentially be carrying over into 2021. It's a little too early to tell yet. However, this mass die-off, a lot of the necropsies that have been done on the whales found on the beach have found that they've been malnourished. Now, the sounders have been largely unaffected by this, right? We still have all 13. They appear to be very healthy. In fact, there's a lot of preliminary research indicating that they're leaving Puget Sound much healthier than when they came in. So is this just a numbers game? Are they just, it's such a small, because again, they're 13 out of that 27,000. Are they just such a small portion of the overall scale that it's not really affecting them? Or could there be something here to be said about that relationship with the ghost shrimp? And then lastly, these are the questions that are going to keep me up at night after I finish this thesis. If I had unlimited time and unlimited resources and just like all the staff in the world, I would love to know the answer of how did they learn to do this? How did they learn to do this? Which whale was the first whale? How long ago did they start? And how are they able to teach others? Because again, not all whales learn this behavior. So there's clearly some relationship going on there. And I would just love to know what it is. So in conclusion, the sounders are spending a statistically significant amount of time within Possession Sound, and this is significant, and we can draw a correlation between the time they spend here and the abundant ghost shrimp that, right, they're here because of that Snohomish River Delta that flows into this area. And there is some evidence, although it's very preliminary, that certain whales may be working or hanging out with other whales. So with that, I wanted to say a huge thank you for everybody for coming today, and a big shout out to John Whitby for doing that Cooccur data for me, and thank you to Aaron and all of my cohort members and all of you for joining. I wouldn't be able to do it without you. And with that, I'm ready to take questions.